In 1974, the name Amityville stopped being just a quiet point on the map of New York and became a synonym for terror. What seemed like an ordinary house on Ocean Avenue hid a secret capable of shaking the entire country. A bloody night would forever mark its walls and open a mystery that, even decades later, remains without a definitive explanation. The story begins with the DeFeo family, residents of the imposing colonial-style house. At first glance, they lived a normal life, a safe neighborhood, a pristine facade, and the image of a united family. But behind the perfect appearance, constant tensions, muffled arguments, and a silent shadow grew, preparing the ground for an unprecedented tragedy. On the early morning of November 13th, 1974, Amityville awoke to an indescribable horror. 6 members of the DeFeo family were found dead in their beds. All were lying face down, with no signs of struggle, as if death had arrived without warning. The culprit, Ronald DeFeo Jr., confessed to executing his own parents and siblings with a rifle. Yet his confession did not answer all the questions. The most disturbing detail was the calmness of the scene. No neighbor heard screams, nor the multiple gunshots that should have alerted the street. All the bodies were positioned in an eerily uniform way, as if they had been arranged after death. Police wondered, why did no one try to escape? Why was there no resistance? The massacre seemed to hide something beyond the simple act of a killer. In court, Ronald DeFeo Jr. presented contradictory versions. In some statements, he claimed to have acted alone. In others, he said he had heard voices inciting him to kill. According to him, these voices came from the house itself, echoing through the walls as orders impossible to ignore. DeFeo was convicted, but his words planted the seed of a disturbing doubt. Was that house cursed? With the crimes splashed across newspapers, the Amityville mansion was marked as the stage of a massacre. The tragedy, however, would only be the first chapter of a macabre narrative. Months later, a new family would move in, unaware they were about to face something even more disturbing than the murders themselves. The house seemed hungry for new victims. George and Kathy Lutz bought the house in 1975 for what was considered a bargain price. For them, it was the perfect opportunity to build a new home with their 3 children. What they didn't know was that, behind the painted walls and spacious rooms, lingered a heavy silence, filled with an invisible energy. The mansion seemed to be waiting for their arrival, as if it had its own plans. Soon after moving in, strange phenomena began to manifest. Doors slammed on their own, foul odors appeared without any apparent cause, and a constant feeling of being watched tormented the family. George, skeptical by nature, tried to ignore the signs, attributing everything to moving stress. But Kathy sensed something malevolent, something that quickly took root in the heart of the house. Nights became unbearable. Footsteps echoed upstairs, crucifixes turned upside down, and the children reported seeing shadowy figures prowling around their rooms. George woke up every night at 3:15 a.m., the same time when, according to records, the DeFeo murders had occurred. Coincidence? For the Lutz family, it felt like the beginning of a nightmare they could not escape. George's behavior also began to change in a terrifying way. He became increasingly aggressive, distant, and obsessed with the fireplace, as if something within the house controlled him. Kathy, meanwhile, claimed she felt presences around her, invisible hands touching her during the night. In less than a month, the family was plunged into a psychological torment that defied any rational explanation. One of the daughters, Missy, claimed she spoke with an imaginary friend named Jody. But it was no ordinary child's fantasy. She described Jody as a creature with glowing red eyes and the form of a giant pig. George and Kathy, terrified, reported having seen this figure at the window on more than one occasion. The demonic animal seemed to watch the family, like a dark guardian of the house. Reports of nausea, sudden fevers, and abrupt mood swings began to affect all the residents. Doors were torn from their hinges, windows shattered on their own, and mysterious stains appeared on the carpet and walls. The atmosphere became increasingly oppressive, suffocating, as if the house itself were alive, determined to either expel or destroy those who dared to live within it. One day, Kathy discovered a hidden room behind a bookshelf in the basement. The walls were painted red, and the space exuded an unbearable stench. The family dog, upon approaching, began to growl and retreat in terror. The room, which did not appear on the official floor plans, was later described as the Red Room, a supposed portal of malevolent energy. The Lutzes sought help from a local priest who agreed to bless the residents. But during the ceremony, he heard a deep, threatening voice command, "Get out!" Shortly after, he became gravely ill with fever and mysterious sores on his hands. The priest refused to return, convinced the house was under the control of demonic forces that defied any blessing. Each night, the phenomena intensified. The piano played by itself, the temperature dropped sharply in certain rooms, and swarms of flies invaded closed windows in the middle of winter. The terror was relentless. The Lutzes, once skeptical, now lived in constant fear. The house, more than haunted, seemed to possess a cruel consciousness, determined to shatter the sanity of its residents. George began to show unsettling similarities to Ronald DeFeo Jr., the murderer. He spent hours in silence, wandering the house with a vacant stare, obsessed with the basement and the fireplace. Kathy, in disturbing dreams, claimed she saw the DeFeo family being murdered over and over again. It was as if the spirit of the crime still lingered in every wall, forcing the new residents to relive the tragedy. With each passing day, fear corroded the family's bonds. The children suffered constant nightmares and appeared with unexplained bruises. Kathy claimed she felt herself levitating above the bed, wrapped in an invisible force. George, meanwhile, reported hearing threatening choruses of voices echoing through the halls. What should have been a home had become a spiritual prison where logic no longer made sense. By the third week, the Lutzes again sought spiritual help, but the response was disheartening. No one wanted to return to that house, neither priests nor mediums. Everyone who entered reported physical pain, macabre visions, and a suffocating energy. Amityville's reputation spread, and the residents became known as the House of Horror, repelling every attempt at salvation. On their final night there, the family witnessed absolute terror. Doors slammed violently, the floor shook, and dark figures moved through the corridors. Kathy described invisible arms grabbing her, while George struggled to keep the children safe. The chaos seemed to announce an inevitable fate. If they stayed, they would never leave alive. In just 28 days, the Lutzes abandoned everything. They fled in the middle of the night, leaving clothes, furniture, and belongings behind. They never returned to collect anything. To them, the Amityville house was not just a haunted property, it was a supernatural trap. Their account, widely reported by the media, turned the mansion into one of the most terrifying mysteries of the 20th century. After the Lutzes fled, the house was investigated by journalists, curiosity seekers, and specialists in paranormal phenomena. Many doubted the truth of the story, accusing the family of seeking fame and profit. But others believed that the intensity of their accounts could not have been invented. The place had already proven its ability to generate tragedy, and now its reputation spread like wildfire. In 1976, paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren were called to examine the residence. Ed, a demonologist, and Lorraine, a clairvoyant medium, were known for handling extreme haunting cases. They entered Amityville prepared for the worst, but what they found surpassed any expectation. Lorraine claimed to feel a demonic and inhuman presence dominating every corner of the house. During the Warrens' investigation, infrared cameras were installed to record any anomalous activity. One of the most disturbing images captured appeared to show a boy with glowing eyes staring from a bedroom doorway. No children were present during the investigation. This photo would become one of the most frightening and controversial pieces of evidence in the Amityville case. Lorraine described the experience as one of the most terrifying of her career. She claimed to have felt a crushing weight on her shoulders, as if hundreds of spirits were trying to communicate all at once. For the Warrens, there was no doubt the house was a portal to something evil. But their statements were met with skepticism, especially from the scientific community and critics of the Lutz family. Meanwhile, the media turned Amityville into a cultural phenomenon. Books, interviews, and debates flooded newspapers and television. The Ocean Avenue mansion ceased to be just a cursed home and became a modern urban legend. The horror of 1974 transformed into spectacle, drawing both believers in occult forces and skeptics eager to expose what they considered a hoax. The book, The Amityville Horror, released in 1977, gave definitive form to the Lutz's narrative. Described as a true story of terror, the account spread worldwide. Soon after, Hollywood seized upon the myth, producing films that would immortalize the house as an icon of horror. But each adaptation added new layers, blending fact, exaggeration, and fiction, making it harder to separate truth from legend. Despite the fame, the house continued to be the subject of serious study. Paranormal experts claimed the DeFeo massacre had opened a spiritual scar on the site, a wound that could never heal. Skeptics, however, insisted it was all nothing more than psychological suggestion and media manipulation. The Amityville house became a battleground between belief and disbelief, mystery and rationality. Later residents reported living relatively normal lives with no notable paranormal phenomena. This raised even more questions. Had the house truly quieted down, or did it simply choose its victims? Were the Lutzes particularly vulnerable to supernatural forces, or had they fabricated everything? The absence of new horrors did not erase the shadow of the stories already told. Even so, tourists and thrill-seekers visited Ocean Avenue in search of strange sensations. Many claimed to feel chills, headaches, and nausea simply by approaching the house. Others saw only an ordinary residence, renovated to deter curiosity. But the fascination persisted. Amityville was no longer just a house, but a symbol of the inexplicable that haunts the human imagination. Today, the house still stands silent, carrying within its walls the weight of real crimes and supernatural accounts. For some, it is merely a building marked by human tragedy. For others, it is one of the darkest portals of modern history. The fact remains that since 1974, Amityville continues to inspire fear, fascination, and the sense that certain places never allow their ghosts to rest. Over the years, independent investigators returned to the Amityville house. Many used modern equipment to detect anomalies: audio recorders, thermal cameras, and motion sensors. Some recordings captured whispered voices, footsteps, and unexplained temperature changes. For believers, it was yet another confirmation of a malevolent presence. For skeptics, merely technical coincidences. One of the most widespread theories was that the house had been built on an ancient Native American burial ground. According to reports, the land had been cursed long before the DeFeos arrived. Though lacking solid historical evidence, this explanation gained traction as it was repeated in books and films. The idea of an ancestral curse reinforced the belief that the residence was doomed from its very origin. Another hypothesis pointed to the mental state of Ronald DeFeo Jr. The murderer claimed to have been influenced by voices, but experts suggested he suffered from severe psychological disorders. Still, the coincidence between his accounts and the phenomena experienced by the Lutzes was unsettling. How could two different groups describe such similar experiences in different eras without ever having contact? Lorraine Warren, until the end of her life, held firm to her conviction that the house harbored something inhuman. She described Amityville as a nest of darkness, a place where evil fed on human weakness. Her testimony, charged with emotion and credibility for many, helped solidify the case as one of the most studied in contemporary demonology. At the same time, critics argued the entire phenomenon was nothing but a grand performance. They claimed the Lutzes were in debt and saw the story as a way to profit. The publication of the book and the sale of movie rights seemed to support this suspicion. But even if it had been a calculated plan, no one explained the intensity of the testimonies, nor the persistence of the legend. The cultural impact of Amityville was immense. Films, documentaries, and TV programs explored the story relentlessly. The terror of the house crossed borders, becoming part of the global collective imagination. Ocean Avenue was no longer just an address. It was a symbol, a warning that the inexplicable could dwell in ordinary places, hidden behind seemingly safe facades. Occult researchers viewed the house as a classic example of demonic infestation. First, subtle manifestations, then physical and psychological attacks. Finally, the complete domination of the family. This progression, they claimed, followed a pattern described in ancient exorcism manuals. Amityville, therefore, was more than an isolated case. It was living proof that dark forces operated in the real world. However, psychology scholars suggested another path. For them, the Lutzes suffered a collective breakdown, born of the trauma of living in a house marked by a brutal massacre. The atmosphere, heavy with the memory of the crime, could have amplified fears, hallucinations, and hysteria. Thus, the horror would not come from ghosts, but from the human mind itself, trapped in a space contaminated by violence. Despite rational explanations, one fact remains undeniable. The Amityville house was never again just an ordinary residence. Even renovated, sold, and inhabited by other families, it continues to be the target of speculation, curiosity, and fear. With each new generation, more people discover the legend and ask themselves, was it all an invention, or is the house truly a portal to evil? The fascination persists because Amityville touches on a universal fear, that our homes, supposedly safe havens, can turn into haunted prisons. The idea that walls can absorb suffering and return it as torment reminds us that evil does not need to dwell in distant cemeteries. It can live right next door or inside our very own house. Over time, the Amityville residence came to be seen as a permanent scar in the history of horror. Even after renovations, a change of house number, and attempts to erase the past, collective memory never allowed the house to be forgotten. The address became a pilgrimage site for the curious and ghost hunters alike, all drawn by the promise of experiencing the unexplainable. Some visitors report feeling dizzy and nauseated just by looking at the house. Others claim to hear whispers coming from the windows, even when the place is sealed shut. For the current residents, these stories are nothing more than inconvenient legends. But for those who know the details, each account reinforces the idea that certain energies never disappear. They merely remain dormant, waiting for new victims. The Amityville case also raised a disturbing question. Can places absorb the essence of heinous crimes? Some scholars believe that extreme violence leaves invisible marks, etched like spiritual scars. In the case of the DeFeos, 6 lives cut short so brutally may have infused the house with an energy that never dissipates, perpetuating the terror. Others argue that the true curse is not in the house, but in the human mind. Fear, when nourished, can create monsters as real as any entity. The Lutz family, living in a setting already stained by massacre, may have become prisoners of their own imagination. A rational theory, but one incapable of erasing the testimonies of those who swore they faced the impossible. In any case, Amityville transcended the limits of a paranormal investigation. It became a mirror of our deepest beliefs, setting science and faith on a collision course. Each visit, each account, each debate reinforces the sensation that we are confronting something that defies easy explanation, something suspended between the real and the supernatural. Even today, some avoid saying the house's name at night. The very sound of the word Amityville evokes images of dark hallways, glowing red eyes in the blackness, and voices whispering into the void. It is not just an old story, but a living myth that feeds on collective fear, growing with every new generation that discovers the terror of Ocean Avenue. For believers, the house remains active even in silence. Each wall is said to be a record of suffering, each room a stage for invisible echoes. The absence of recent phenomena does not signify peace, but merely a lull. Evil, some investigators claim, knows how to wait, and when least expected, it returns with devastating force. Cinema and literature ensured that Amityville would never be forgotten. But unlike other horror legends, this case was born from concrete facts. 6 real murders. From that foundation, the supernatural found fertile ground to grow. Perhaps this fusion of brutal crime and paranormal mystery is the reason Amityville remains so deeply disturbing. Decades after 1974, the house still stands as a grim reminder that evil can dwell anywhere. Whether in the form of a murderer driven by voices, a family terrorized by invisible forces, or a myth fueled by collective fear, Amityville remains an enigma. And enigmas, when soaked in blood, are never erased. Thus, the House of Horrors continues to haunt us with one question: what really happened in Amityville? Was it the work of a disturbed killer, of demonic entities, or of the human imagination? The answer may never be found, but one truth is undeniable. Since that night in 1974, the house has never again been just bricks and wood. It became an eternal icon of terror.